how that all came about. This came about because of Father Frank's last talk. If you were here for it, he talked about the symbolism of art, or symbolism in Christian and Catholic art. And it dawned on us after that there's a lot that goes on in these works here that we might not be aware of. But it all begins in sort of around 2015 to 2016, when I came back from a trip to Italy and first met Father John, and he was getting ready with an idea for renovating the church. If you all remember, maybe those of you who weren't here, this is what our church looked like back then. Above the high altar is the painted image of Saint Stanislaus, who was the patron saint of the former name of the church prior to being renamed Holy Family, being carried to heaven with angels. And to the right and left is the Sacred Heart of Jesus on the left, and the Virgin Mary statues on the right. And they stood there against a blank wall that was put there probably sometime in the 1960s. I think our parish historian, Louise, over here could tell us exactly when that renovation happened that changed it. But Father brought me into the church and he asked me two things. He said, first, Jeremiah, I'd like to put some niches behind the statuaries, because a niche, coming from the Latin nest or Italian nicho, the scallop shell, is a little doorway to heaven in the afterlife. And so statuaries really ought to have niches. They're supposed to have niches, and of course ours lacked them, but not forever. And let me give you some examples. This is what typically a niche looks like. These are two examples from Rome. And again, in 2016, this is what our side altars looked like, sort of spare and sparse, except that they weren't always this way. Again, thanks to our parish historian, Louise. These are photographs in our history book that show that back in at least up to 1968, we had paintings of niches behind the statuaries. Sadly, when the wallpaper was removed, we were hoping to renovate these paintings, but the paintings were completely destroyed. And so it became a project where I had to reinvent the niches from square one. So these are some of my concept sketches for the niches that are in place. The problem that we had is that part of it could be three-dimensional, but part of it could not. We could not dig into the walls and create an actual niche because the walls had all sorts of electrical in them and other services. So what I did instead is I looked at the details of the altars that are in place now. Those are the side tabernacle altars that are now being used for votives. And I constructed a pediment, which is on the right. So I kind of became a carpenter. This is what an artist does. If you don't know how to do something, you figure it out, and you talk to every expert friend that you have to do so. And so the top section and the columns are three-dimensional, but the center is completely painted. For those of you that didn't realize this, the center is not actually three-dimensional, it's flat. And it's painted in what we call trompe l'oeil, or anamorphic perspective, to make you believe that it's actually three-dimensional. It's all based on the laws of linear perspective and how you see them from a certain vantage point. It also matters that there's certain lighting so we made sure to have the lighting and the shadowing correct to how the lighting in the church is. So it feels as if the correct lighting is falling on them. This is an image from the floor of my studio when my wife and I couldn't have done this project without my family. This is my wife, Julie, my daughter, Melanie. My daughter, Anna, can't be here tonight because she's not feeling well. But this is what it looked like before being brought to the church. The two columns on the left and right and the pediment at the top are three-dimensional, including the capitals. The middle section is flat.
When you do shadow to get the 3D effect,
yes.
Does that create it in your mind, or do you set up a model with lighting to create that you can reproduce?
Brother Rick, both. It's both modeled and also based on my own knowledge of how light would fall on a shape that looked like that. And it's I'm not going to go into it. It's fairly complicated, but ultimately it's probably a good thing I did this project in my late 40s and not younger, because it takes that much time to sort of learn this sort of thing. Anyways, this is what our Sacred Heart of Jesus now looks like, standing in his niche, and all of it designed to feel as if it was always part of those altars. That was critical to me, is that it felt like it was never added, that it was just part of the real. What do you think, Louise? They're not exactly like those paintings in the past, but
I was happy to see that.
I bet you were. So let's get into the Holy Family crucifix, because I think it's going to be interesting for a lot of you. The second thing I was asked by Father John would be that if I could paint over St. Stanislaus. If I could just paint clouds over him. Because he was no longer the namesake of the church, and he created a very odd focal point. People were wondering if it was God. People were wondering if it's St. Peter, who this was. And I said to him, Father, if you can let me do this, I'd rather come up with a different solution, a solution through addition rather than subtraction. I've seen in traveling to Italy far too many instances where styles change and people decide that they want to remove the old and get rid of the old and put in the new. And in fact, that's what was done to our side niches one day, and then we came to a point where we wanted them back, but they were irreparable. So what I did instead, and it's a design problem, I basically discovered that what we simply needed was a new focal point. And so I came up with some concept sketches, and the key to this was a crucifix that would hang above the high altar. And this is actually a digital mock-up of what it would look like. This is way before even making any of the art. This is what I was able to propose, was the idea that essentially from the central point of view of the church, the crucifix would become would obscure the St. Stanislaus painting, but our parishioners that, of course, still have a love of St. Stanislaus and a history here at the church could peek around to the side and still catch a glimpse of that painting that they remember for their whole lives. And I didn't really do anything, I would say, inventive here. I simply went back to my history. The earliest history, the San Damiano cross from Assisi, the cross that St. Francis prayed to, that spoke to him and said, Francis, rebuild my church. And it sort of dawned on me that that was kind of what I was being asked to help do, was to rebuild a church. A little side note, the image of St. Francis praying on the bottom left is one of my best friends, Dennis Nolan, an illustrator who was able to illustrate the life of St. Francis in a children's book written by Robert Kennedy. But you can see the San Damiano cross. And this cross has a typical medieval shape. For all over Italy. There's another example by Cimabue in Arezzo. In fact, this cross is above the high altar and it obscures paintings by Piero della Francesca. So I didn't think too much of obscuring St. Stanislaus slightly, because certainly St. Stanislaus is beautiful, but he's not painted by Piero della Francesca. He's painted by somebody else, probably quite anonymous. And I thought if a crucifix could block Piero della Francesca, we should be able to incorporate one here at Holy Family. And so these are some examples of these crosses from history. They go back to the 1200s, the 1100s, and into the early Renaissance. And there was a difference in them, what's called the Christus Triumphans, the triumphant Christ, showing himself as overcoming death right there on the cross. And again, as the history of the church evolves and as theology digs deeper, theology and thoughts about the church have gone back and forth, and there's been, as Father Frank points out, different popes that have come about and clarified things, and they've had councils that have clarified things. At some point in the history of the medieval period, it became desired that we would have Christus Patiens on the cross, in other words, the dead Christ. And so Father John and I consulted, and we decided that our crucifix should be the moment that Christ has died, the very moment that he gave his life. And so just to give you an idea, typically in these crosses, they're beautiful designs. They have Mary on Christ's right, St. John on his left, that comes out of the Gospel and the Passion, when Christ turns to John and says, "Behold your mother." And so in addition, behind Christ is what's called the drape of honor, or the apron. And what it's also there for is to form what's called the quadrate shape, which is that cross with the central section that's kind of expanded beyond the cross. That drape of honor is used by artists throughout history to do different things. Sometimes just a patterned fabric. Sometimes it has images in it. I've seen examples where the whole Passion of Christ is painted inside of that drape of honor. We decided we want to do something similar, and the drape of honor in ours is there for two reasons. Number one, because it's beautiful, But number two, it widened the cross enough so that it would actually do the job of creating a new focal point and not completely, but well enough obstructing the domed paintings behind in the dome of the church. Again, I was not going to be part of removing St. Stanislaus. In fact, I think I said to my wife, if I go through with that, I'm going to have to move out of Deerfield, because I think I'd have Louise would be at my front door with her shovel ready to knock me over the head. It all began with the initial drawing. This is a full-scale charcoal drawing of the dead Christ. And this still is in my studio. And then it begins with the construction. And so again, I'm building what's called the cradling, which allows everything to be very lightweight. The entire cross weighs 19 pounds. The panel that it's on is very thin. It's about 1/8 of an inch. And this was all constructed at my University of Hartford over a winter break, 2018. Glued together. In fact, I think that's the best use for Art News, is to use it as a little glue prop. It's kind of a magazine that many of us that work in this way have our differences with. In my backyard, shaping the panel with a router, Brother Russo would get this one, right? Just good old construction work. And then a layer of what's called rabbit skin glue gesso. This is a mixture of chalk and glue made from the skin of a rabbit. And it's an old recipe that goes back to the Middle Ages, and we still do it to this day. It's the only surface that will allow us to paint with the traditional egg tempera, and that was critical to me. I wanted to make this with a medium that was traditional, and so it's paint that's made with the yolk of a chicken egg. In order to do that, you have to have a surface that it can glue well to. So this is the completed panel. It's quite beautiful white. It's sort of inviting, isn't it? And then the drawing behind in my corner of my studio. The next step is to actually put on that panel with ink the drawing that was on the paper with charcoal. And that's all done just by eye, looking at the charcoal drawing and matching it over to the right with ink. And then there's a process of building up what's called the pastilia. Pastilia is a raised area done with a clay that allows the gilding of gold leaf to shine a little more because it's raised. And so I'm going to show you how we dealt with the halos. So this is how it started. This is all very tedious work. You dribble the clay slowly in layers like a stalagmite is formed in a cave, and eventually it builds up to something three-dimensional. You layer that with what's called red bole, which is also a clay, mixed with rabbit skin glue, so that when you wet it, the glue becomes tacky and it allows us to adhere a sheet of gold leaf. Gold leaf is thinner than you can imagine. In fact, you can't hold it with your fingers. It's my great friend who's a great gilder and actually came to help me and teach me how to do this, since it was amongst one of the first times I've done gilding, but never this intricate. Fred Wessel, he said to me, gilding is like working with dandruff and trying to make a beautiful image with it. Well, with Fred's tutelage, we gilded the halos of Christ and of St. John and Mary, and then I tooled them with a piece of ivory, sharpened like a pencil, so that they radiate these radiations of light. And in Christ's halo, of course, it has the cross shape, which is typical in those there. That's done with what's called burnishing, using a dog's tooth on a stick and slowly polishing the gold in that one area so that it becomes mirror polished and reflects light differently. That's all it is. It's the same gold leaf, a single layer of gold leaf, polished differently. And so it reflects light in a different way. Then the process of painting, and what I love is the beginning of an egg temper painting of a human being starts with 5 colors. This goes back to the tradition. White, terra verde, a green earth clay. Verdaccio, the bad green. Verdaccio literally means the ugly green. Burnt umber, which is earth from the ground in Umbria that's burnt in a kiln and makes a brown, and then black. Why is that significant? Because God formed man in his image from the clay of the earth. He formed him. right? From the earth we're formed. And so our initial layers on a human being in painting go back to the earth colors: terra verde, verdaccio, and burnt umber. So this is the layers that you guys don't ever see. I got to see, my wife got to see, a couple of visitors. But this is the verdaccio green underpainting, what's called the terra verde, verdaccio, burnt umber, black and white green underpainting to the painting that's in the church. So for a long time, it goes through what we call like the Kermit the Frog stage, or the Hulk stage. And it's a process of making it look three-dimensional, all in green. If somebody is living, and you paint a living person, then you overlay the green with lots of pinks and reds to bring back the life in the flesh. So very much like breathing the blood back into the flesh, right? But with Christ who had just died, what would happen and what had happened is all of the life is pulled from the body, and we end up with the image of the corpus, which is actually not far away from green. Isn't that true? No, we've seen it. Sadly, we see that happens. So my process was doing very subtle layers of slight pinks over those greens to allow them to shift ever so slightly and to come to the form of that body that felt like a dead human being was hanging there on that cross. Because, yes.
How did you apply?
Very thinly.
By brush?
It's all by brush, by hand.
Is it strokes?
It's little strokes, little tiny strokes. You can see it a little bit in the beard, the strokes that come through there. We can't forget that he really died. He felt pain. He hurt. He hung there in pain as a human being dying on that cross for us. And it was important to me that came through. So this is the development of the painting kind of in its medium stage. There's actually two types of gilding. One is the gilding that I showed you earlier where we can polish the gold. The other is actually gold that's ground up into a powder and made into a paint. And so then it's painted on. That's called shell gold, and it reflects differently. So if you look at the crucifix, the gold around the rest of the cross is slightly less vibrant than the gold of the halos. That was important to me because the halos should have the most light. And then with many months' work, in December of 2018, we completed, just in time for the bishop's visit, the Holy Family Parish Crucifix, the gift of our family to the parish, to be there hopefully above the altar for many, many years. If we look up close, we can see that there were some things symbolically, though, and this is the meat of the talk that I think everybody's waiting for. What about all this secret symbolism? It's not all that secret, but I hope it's something that when you see it now, maybe you won't unsee it. The color of the drape of honor. First of all, without pattern, simple, because after all, we do live in the 21st century, and styles aren't as embellished. We're not living in the Baroque period anymore. We don't put capitals with correlations all over our houses. Well, maybe at Christmas time we doll it up a bit, but for the most part, especially in New England, we live in a simpler kind of style. So, but that color is significant because, in fact, it's the color of the robe that Christ puts on himself in triumph in the Sacred Heart statue. It's the red of passion, but also it's very, very much the same red that we see there. The idea being that visually it unifies the altar, so that the size of the statue of the Sacred Heart, the size of the statue of Mary, and the size of the crucifix all feel like one. With color and gesture, we see, and Father Frank alluded to this, Mary wearing her blue and red. If you were here a month ago, you know exactly what that is all about. On the right, St. John wears green and red, so a little bit more of a humble color, green, a color more of the earth. The gesture, though, Mary's praying her rosary. She's actually praying the decade of when Christ dies on the cross. And on the right of the painting, St. John is making a gesture with his hand towards his chest. What is he saying? He's saying, me? She's my mother? Oh, she's my mother now. I've been tasked by you to take care of her, I guess. Because as you are passing on the cross, Somebody needs to watch over this woman in pain and lamentation. And so he's being asked something very, very poignant there, isn't he, Father? And he doesn't refuse it. He takes it on. He pulls that hand to the chest saying, okay, I will do that. He brings it to his heart. Another symbol I've been asked a ton about is what's at the top. Is it a stork? What is it? It's a pelican. Because in a lot of these, and I didn't invent this. I stole it right from the medieval people. And in the Middle Ages, if you had a crucifix where there was all that suffering, you had to have a sign of hope somewhere. And so early on, they started using different symbols. The lioness breathing life into her cubs. So you might see a lioness breathing into the mouth of a baby lion. That's the lioness breathing into the mouth of the cubs. In the case of the pelican, pelicans preen and bleed, and the babies will eat the blood. And the medieval person saw this as a symbol of Christ's passion. And of course, the fact that he's feeding us. So we are the baby pelicans. And the only difference with mine is I have 3. What I do have, though, in the branch of the tree, they make their nest on the tree of life. And the tree of life, each branch, it represents one of the continents of the earth. So the church, as Father Frank said today, expanded throughout the whole earth. The Christ's message has gotten around the entire globe. And that's what the tree represents. There's another bit, though, that's unseen. And this is going to be really fun, I hope. And it's what we call sacred geometry. It's essentially the concept of what we call squaring the circle. In other words, throughout our whole history, in fact, back to the Greek times, when the Greeks were the leading minds of geometry in the world, there was a belief that every shape had meaning, and that every shape could represent either God and heaven or earth, and even geometric shapes that seemed to not represent anything actually carried quite a bit of meaning. And so the most sacred shape was a circle, the infinite circle with no beginning, no end. Where have we heard that before, right? There's no beginning, no end to God. And of course it's the circle, because it's God's creation, right? And humans, when we create things, we don't create things like this, do we? We create things that have square corners. And so the shape of the circle was representative of God, the perfection of the circle. But God makes man in his image. And so the symbol of a man, or humans, was a square. The square is almost a circle, in that it's symmetrical height and width and side to side, except that it has square corners. And it does have a beginning and an end at its quarters. And yet, the circle can fit beautifully into the square, or vice versa. The square can fit into the circle. This idea of marrying together, unionizing humans with God, transcending that relationship between heaven and earth. In its simplest form, drawn as a line. But we see this form throughout our architecture. This is the Pantheon in Rome, and there's the square and the circle. Of course, this Pantheon was built for a pagan religion, the Roman religion that believed in 12 gods and goddesses. But the Catholic Church took this space over. It never was destroyed, and made it into a church. And decided not to get rid of the flooring. One of the reasons, because it's beautiful, but also because it carried the same symbolism that they wanted to make sure people knew, the symbolism of Catholicism. Symmetry, though, is really the key to all this, and we see symmetry in a lot of other shapes, right, that have meaning and that have helped people come closer to God. And this idea of squaring the circle, we can see that all of these shapes relate to that. And then we're not far off to this, which is the Christian cross, slightly asymmetrical, slightly taller at the bottom, because it said that Christ was crucified above us. We had to look up to him. So a lot of this comes from in terms of the concepts for what's called sacred geometry, they start to get written down by an architect named Vitruvius. And he writes a whole treatise on architecture where he talks about the temple and the temple of the body and how they work together. And one of his messages, which was that artists and architects spent years trying to translate and figure out, was this message of how a man, if placed on his back, flat, and have hands extended to the sides, would essentially fit into a square with the center at the navel, with the fingers and toes out. But then also a human could fit into a circle where the center was actually at the genitalia. Well, this idea of the square and the circle fitting together, that a human is in fact a square and a circle at the same time, that was what Vitruvius said. Well, it took the most brilliant Leonardo da Vinci to finally crack the code, because it couldn't be cracked. And what he showed is, in fact, what Vitruvius mentions is the center being the navel, but never mentions this is the other center. Da Vinci shows that, yes, it is possible. The difference, though, is that to fit into a circle, we have to extend our arms and legs outward a bit. And what that does is it lowers the center. And so, yes, the center of the circle is the navel, but the center of the square is the genitals. Now, we'll come back to that in a minute, because that actually has some significance. In all this, though, how do we seek the divine in everything? Because it is in everything. So it even must be in shapes that are not necessarily symmetrical. So how do we find the divine in what we call asymmetrical shapes, or shapes that have variational measurements from one side to another? And so artists started coming up with what they call the divine proportion of a golden rectangle or spiral, a rectangle that would have something unique about it. And the uniqueness was this. If we take any line and divide it, we can either divide it symmetrically in half, or we can divide it in one spot on that line where the measurement of the shorter to the bigger part was equal in ratio to the bigger part to the whole. Okay? And we can show you this in a moment. The idea is what's called a golden set of measurements. So this rectangle, if I took the measurement of the height and compared it to the width, the ratio, height ratio width is equal to the width compared to the height plus the width. And there's really only one place that happens. And it's a repeating thing. It's called a Fibonacci sequence. And some of you may have heard this kind of concept of Fibonacci coming up with a sequence of measurements. So we can make them, and they're actually quite easy to make. We start with a square. We bisect the square through its center. We take the hypotenuse of the right side or left side. We drop that down off its arc. We arc it down flat. And we then simply lift up the side. So we extend a line. We lift up the side, and we finish off the rectangle. And there we have it. We have a golden rectangle. That's how simple it is. And that creates a set of measurements. This is crazy. It creates a set of measurements where the height compared to the width is equal to the width compared to the height plus the width. Every time. And if we want to make a golden spiral, we simply take a square out of that rectangle. We go back to the square. And if we look at the shape to the right, guess what it is? It's a golden rectangle. In other words, the remaining piece is golden. Okay, and if we take a square out of that, we have another golden rectangle left. And they get smaller and smaller and smaller. And if we then form arcs in each of the squares off the corner with a compass, we end up with creating a repetition through that creates what we call the golden spiral. You've seen this before. If you've looked at a pineapple carefully, you've seen this shape. If you've looked at sunflowers, you've seen this shape. If you've looked at a nautilus shell, you've seen this shape. Because it's the shape of things that grow on the earth. Now, I don't want to trigger anybody, but I think there's some people in here that find this fun. There's actually some math to this. Okay. Don't panic. Do you all remember Pythagoras' theorem of right triangles? A squared plus b squared equals c squared. So, by nature, the diagonal we talked about that we use to extend is the square root of 5. If we start with a 2 by 2 square, meaning that we end up with a rectangle to the right that's a 1 by 2 size, right? So 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 1 plus 4 is 5, so that diagonal must be the square root of 5. If we drop that down, then we end up with an equation where we add 1 to the square root of 5, and we divide it by 2. And the number we end up with is a extending number, what's called an imperfect number, going on and on and on forever, but it basically starts with 1.618. In other words, 0.618 compared to 1 is equal to 1 compared to 1.618, and so on and so on and so on. And that ratio will continue to build on itself forever and ever and ever in what's called perfect golden proportions. The golden ratio, therefore, is 1 to 1.618. The ancient Greeks named that symbol phi, and they gave it that symbol, phi. Some of you are seeing something here, right? They used it to build their buildings, their temples. That's why if you've ever had the blessing to be able to go to a Greek temple, they feel perfect to walk into. The Christian churches were designed in the same way. Artists use the golden rules or the golden measurements in paintings. This is the painting of the Birth of Venus by Botticelli, showing how he used the golden spiral to work up the Flora and Aeolus's shape as they fly in from the left. I like this one of Fra Angelico's Annunciation, where he uses the golden measurements throughout the whole painting to depict the angel Gabriel speaking to the Virgin Mary that, behold, she's with child. Right?
Are they doing that by design?
It's all by design. It's all totally on purpose.
I think that a very talented artist who doesn't know anything about this might instinctively, they just might end up tracing
Yes.
figures exactly.
It's a great question, and the answer is yes. Instincts can create images with an order that ends up being close to this. In fact, photographers use what's called the rule of thirds, 1 to 1.618.
Yeah.
Okay? It's very much like that. It also shows up in other things, though. This is Superstorm Sandy. And let's go back to that number 5. You remember how we create golden proportions? Perfect proportions of something asymmetric? Something maybe what we call organic? What does it remind you of? The second a human being is formed in the womb. When God forms that human being through the love marriage of a man and a woman. Believe it or not, Da Vinci's marks on the bottom. Do you see those, that line?
Yeah.
He's showing us that the measurement of the tip of our finger, 1 to 1.618. 1 to 1.618. 1 to 1.618. 1 to 1.618. 1 tip to elbow to tip of finger. 1 to 1.618. Cool. So let's have a look at what happens with the cross. First, a perfect square. And then the golden rectangle. And some golden rectangles in the negative shapes. Because it's not just what's positive that's important, but also the spaces between. And if we look at measurements through the crucifix, these are 3 sequential 1 to 1.618 growths. And if we hold on to that light blue arrow to the right, that measurement is the same as there. If we look at the Virgin Mary, she's within a golden rectangle, except there's a little extra to her chamber. But why is the chamber a little bit bigger? Because her world is not interfering with Christ's. Right to his fingertip. It's the golden rectangle. And of course her hands pray right on the what's called the vortex of the spiral. If we take the spiral and begin right at the forehead of Christ, in the wounds of his crown of thorns, the wounds of the crown of thorn, the wound in his side, and the wound in his hand are all lined up on the golden spiral. We look at it this way, again, with the division going from the tip of the toe to where the tree is, the root of the tree, right? Christ's toe is the root of the whole church, right? From the tip of the toe to the root of the tree, with the division, the first division of the first square that comes out of that is right through the wound in the side. And we follow along. We have the wound in his foot, the wound in his hand, and other hand on the spiral. This was given to the church on December 16th, and thanks to my really great friends, Paul Naboski and Rich Soika, many of you know them really well. They helped install the cross in its current home, and there it hangs during Advent of 2018 and still to this day. So we can remind ourselves that this was what it used to be, and with a little bit of work and ingenuity, the altar that we have is now like this. And I think it's definitely a testament to everyone that put time into that. And I was just very blessed to be able to be part of it. So thank you everybody for your time, and I'm more than happy to answer questions as well, as Father Frank did.